In this episode, we are focusing on one of the deepest foundations of responsible artificial intelligence, AI governance. The training data that shapes what a system can learn, repeat, miss, distort, or amplify. New learners sometimes imagine that training data is just a large pile of examples poured into a model, as if quantity alone turns information into intelligence. In reality, training data has to be governed with discipline long before model training begins, because the data carries legal, operational, and ethical consequences that will echo throughout the life of the system. If an organization cannot show that it had the right to use the data, understood where it came from, knew what quality limits it carried, protected its integrity, and confirmed that it truly fit the intended use case, then the system may look sophisticated while resting on a weak and risky foundation. Good training data governance is not a side task. It is one of the clearest ways an organization proves that it understands the difference between building a model and building a system it can actually trust, explain, defend, and improve over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to understand that training data governance is broader than data collection. It includes the choices made before data is gathered, the rules applied while it is handled, the judgments made about what belongs in or out, the records kept about where it came from, and the controls used to protect it from misuse, contamination, and drift away from the approved purpose. When organizations fail at this stage, they often fail in ways that are not obvious at first. The model may still produce smooth outputs, pass basic tests, and impress project sponsors, while the deeper weaknesses stay hidden until someone asks where the examples came from, whether the data was legally usable, why certain groups are poorly represented, or how the team knows the data still reflects the real task. Training data governance, therefore, begins with a mindset shift. The organization must stop treating data as raw material lying around for the taking and start treating it as governed evidence that needs clear rights, clear purpose, clear boundaries, and clear accountability before it is ever used to shape model behavior. Training data rights are the first major issue because an organization cannot responsibly use data just because it has access to it. Access is not the same thing as permission, and possession is not the same thing as lawful or contractually acceptable use. A team may find a large data set online, receive data from a vendor, inherit old internal records, or scrape content from public-facing sources and still have serious unanswered questions about whether that material can be used for training. Rights governance means understanding the legal basis, license terms, contractual restrictions, consent conditions, confidentiality obligations, and purpose limitations attached to the data. It also means understanding whether the data contains material that could create obligations toward individuals, institutions, creators, or business partners. Beginners often think this is purely a lawyer's problem, but it is not. The project team needs to know enough to recognize that training choices have legal consequences, and that weak rights discipline at the data stage can create compliance, reputational, and operational trouble long after the model appears to be working. A second challenge with rights is that the answer is often less simple than yes or no. Some data may be usable for one purpose, but not another. Some data may be available for internal analysis, but not for model training. Some data may come from a source that allows limited use under conditions the team has not actually satisfied. Even internally created data may be more restricted than teams assume, because the records may include confidential material, sensitive personal information, or content gathered in a context that did not clearly support later training uses. This is why strong governance does not stop at a vague statement that the organization owns the data or that the data was publicly available. It asks what rights actually exist, what limitations travel with those rights, what downstream uses were contemplated, and what evidence the organization can show if those rights are later questioned. A team that cannot answer those questions should not treat the data as ready for training, because a model built on uncertain rights may later become difficult to deploy, difficult to share, or difficult to defend when scrutiny arrives. Records matter greatly here because rights are much easier to claim than to prove. A mature organization keeps clear documentation about where training data came from, under what authority it was obtained, what terms or permissions apply, whether any restrictions exist on reuse or redistribution, and who approved the decision to include it in the training set. That documentation becomes especially important when data is drawn from several sources or when the project changes scope over time. A model that begins as an internal experiment may later be proposed for broader deployment, at which point earlier assumptions about allowable data use may no longer be enough. The organization should not have to rebuild the story of its data from memory after the system is already valuable and difficult to unwind. Strong rights governance, therefore, includes chain of custody thinking, not in the narrow criminal sense, but in the practical governance sense of being able to show where the data came from, how it entered the project, and why its use was considered acceptable at the time. That is how rights become defensible rather than merely assumed. Quality is the next major issue, and it is one of the most misunderstood because people often reduce it to whether the data looks clean. Cleanliness matters, but training data quality is much broader than removing duplicate rows or fixing obvious errors. High-quality training data is relevant to the intended task, sufficiently accurate for the purpose, appropriately labeled where labels matter, consistent enough to avoid teaching conflicting patterns, and complete enough that important parts of the use case are not silently missing. It should also reflect the kinds of inputs the system is likely to encounter once it is in operation, rather than only the easiest or most polished examples available to the team. Poor quality data can still train a model that sounds persuasive, which is why this issue is so dangerous. The system may produce confident outputs while inheriting ambiguity, distortion, and inconsistency from the data that taught it. Good governance means asking not whether the data set is large or convenient, but whether it is accurate and meaningful enough to teach the model the behavior the organization actually wants. Quality also depends on the relationship between the data and the human judgments embedded within it. If labels, classifications, outcomes, or annotations were created inconsistently, then the model may learn inconsistency as if it were truth. If historical records reflect rushed decisions, missing context, outdated policies, or unequal treatment, then the model may absorb those patterns without understanding any of the conditions that produced them. This is why training data quality cannot be treated as a purely technical problem solved by pre-processing scripts. The organization has to examine who created the data, how those records were generated, what the labels really mean, and whether the apparent signal is actually stable enough to teach the system something worth repeating. A project team may discover that some data is technically well formatted but conceptually weak because the categories do not map cleanly to the intended use case, or because historical outcomes reflected a messy human process rather than a standard the organization wants to encode. Quality governance is therefore also judgment governance. Quantity creates another common misunderstanding because teams often assume that more data automatically means better learning. Sometimes more data helps, but only when the additional material is relevant, lawful, representative, and well-governed. More of the wrong data can reinforce the wrong patterns, very rare but important cases, and create false confidence because the team sees impressive scale without noticing weak coverage where it matters most. A smaller, better-governed data set may produce a more reliable and more defensible system than a much larger collection gathered without clear purpose or scrutiny. Quantity should therefore be judged in relation to the task. The team needs enough data to cover meaningful variation, enough difficult cases to prevent the model from learning only the simple patterns, and enough examples from relevant context that the system is not trained on a narrow slice of reality and then asked to perform broadly. Quantity is not just about size. It is about whether the organization has enough of the right material, in the right balance, for the right reason. This is especially important when the use case includes rare but high-consequence situations. If the training data is dominated by routine cases, the model may look strong on average while being least useful in exactly the situations where the organization most needs careful performance. That is a governance problem because averages can hide operational weakness. A triage system trained mostly on ordinary messages may perform poorly on subtle signs of crisis. A screening tool trained mostly on standard cases may behave unpredictably when it encounters less common profiles or unusual combinations of features. The solution is not always to gather endless amounts of data. Sometimes it means deliberately curating data to ensure that important edge conditions, underrepresented contexts, and difficult examples are visible during training and evaluation. Good quantity governance therefore asks what the system must be prepared to handle, what forms of variation matter most, and whether the training set contains enough meaningful coverage to justify trust in the intended use case. Integrity is another pillar of training data governance, and it focuses on whether the data remains reliable, authentic, protected, and free from unauthorized or harmful alteration throughout its lifecycle. A training set can lose integrity in several ways. Data may be corrupted accidentally through bad transfers, weak version control, or careless preprocessing. It may be contaminated by mixed sources the team does not fully understand, or deliberately manipulated through poisoning, malicious contribution, or hidden tampering meant to shape model behavior in unsafe ways. Even without an outside attacker, integrity can be weakened when data pipelines are sloppy enough that nobody can tell which version of the data was actually used for training or whether sensitive material was added or removed without proper review. This is why integrity governance matters far beyond cybersecurity specialists. The organization needs to protect training data as a controlled asset, because the integrity of the system's future behavior depends heavily on the integrity of the material that taught it in the first place. Protecting integrity requires both technical and procedural discipline. Teams need version control for data sets, reliable records of pre-processing steps, clear boundaries around who can modify training material, and review points that make unauthorized or poorly understood changes easier to detect. They also need provenance, which means being able to trace data back to its source and understand how it moved from original collection to training-ready form. Without that, the team may not notice when a data set has drifted away from the approved source, when an internal copy has been edited inconsistently, or when contamination from testing or live use has entered the training pool in ways that make later evaluation misleading. Integrity also means guarding against leakage across stages. If evaluation material finds its way into training, the model may appear stronger than it really is. If live corrections are merged back into training without governance, the team may accidentally train the system on artifacts of its own earlier mistakes. Integrity is about making sure the data remains what the organization thinks it is. Fitness for purpose ties all of these concerns together because rights, quality, quantity, and integrity mean little if the data is still the wrong fit for the actual task. Data that was acceptable for one use may be a poor foundation for another. Records gathered for administrative convenience may not reflect the judgments needed for a high-stakes predictive system. Public text that looks rich and abundant may be a weak basis for training a system expected to operate in a specialized environment with different language, expectations, and standards of evidence. This is why organizations have to ask whether the training data actually matches the approved use case, the operating context, and the decisions the system will influence. Fitness for purpose is not a technical afterthought. It is a governance judgment about alignment. A model can be trained on lawful, high-quality, well-protected data and still be a poor system if that data does not represent the domain, the users, the risks, and the kinds of inputs the deployed system will truly face. One of the hardest parts of fitness for purpose is recognizing proxy problems. Teams often use data that seems related to the task because direct measures are unavailable, expensive, or messy, but the proxy may not capture what the organization actually cares about. Historical outcomes may reflect earlier choices, not ground truth. User engagement may reflect novelty or convenience, not value or fairness. Administrative categories may reflect record-keeping needs, not meaningful distinctions from model learning. If those proxies are used without careful thought, the model may become very good at reproducing something the organization never intended to optimize. That is why fitness for purpose demands close collaboration between technical teams, domain experts, and governance leaders. The question is not only whether the model can learn patterns from the data. The deeper question is whether those patterns correspond to the real-world judgment, task, or support function the organization wants the system to perform. When that answer is weak, the training data should not be treated as fit, even if it is easy to obtain. A mature organization governs all of this through a structured workflow rather than a series of informal decisions scattered across the project. Before training begins, the team should have a process for reviewing proposed data sources, checking rights and restrictions, examining quality and representativeness, confirming integrity protections, and judging fitness for purpose against the approved use case. That workflow should include clear accountability, because it is rarely enough to let one individual quietly decide that the data seems acceptable. Different perspectives matter. Legal or compliance review may be needed for rights questions. Operational knowledge may be needed to judge fitness for purpose, and technical review may be needed to assess integrity and quality risks. The value of structure here is not bureaucracy for its own sake. It is that training data decisions are often too consequential to be made casually. Once the model is trained and the project gains momentum, it becomes much harder to revisit the foundations with the seriousness they deserved at the start. Governance also continues during and after model development. Training data decisions should not disappear once a model version has been produced, because later questions may arise about retraining, fine-tuning, data refresh, feedback incorporation, and expansion into new uses. If new data sources are proposed, the organization needs to revisit rights, quality, quantity, integrity, and fitness instead of assuming the original approval covers everything forever. If the model is struggling in production, the answer is not automatically to pour in more data. The team should first ask whether the added material is legally usable, relevant to the failure pattern, high enough in quality, and consistent with the original purpose and risk controls. This is one reason documentation matters so much in training data governance. The organization needs a living record of what data was used, why it was approved, what limitations were known, and what must be reconsidered if the system changes. Without that record, retraining can become a quiet source of drift rather than a disciplined act of improvement. By the end of this topic, the main lesson should be clear. Governing training data is not just about collecting enough examples to make a model learn. It is about ensuring the organization had the right to use the data, that the data is relevant and reliable enough to teach the intended behavior, that the volume and balance of data support the real task instead of hiding weakness, that the data remains protected and traceable as it moves through the pipeline, and that the full collection is genuinely fit for the purpose the system is supposed to serve. Rights prevent the organization from building on uncertain authority. Quality helps prevent weak or inconsistent learning. Quantity shapes whether important variation is visible. Integrity protects the foundation from contamination and confusion. Fitness for purpose keeps the project aligned with reality. When those 5 ideas are governed seriously, the training data becomes something the organization can defend with evidence rather than something it simply hopes will hold together under pressure. That is why training data governance is one of the most important foundations of trustworthy AI.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.